Hey guys, it's Mr. C, and we're looking at Chapter 2, Lesson 4, which is solving equations with variables on both sides. And obviously what I should learn is to write and solve equations with variables on both sides of the equation, both in word problems and just in basic equations. And it might sound a little weird, how can you have variables on both sides of the equation? But you already have the skills to do this. You just need to see it and to go through it a couple times. So let's start with an example of what I'm even talking about. I'm talking about something like 7 plus 3h equals, now usually you just have a number and you solve, but now we're going to add a variable to this side and mix it up a little bit. The only extra step that's involved in solving these is to bring, and I'm going to write this out first, so bring all the variables to one side of the equation. So I can't solve an equation when I've got some variables here and some variables here. They all need to come together. So you have two options always when you're solving this kind of equation. You can either take this side of the equation and move it over here, or you can take this side of the equation and move it over here. The important thing to note is that regardless of what you choose to do, you will end up with the same answer as long as you're not making any calculation errors. So I am going to show you one of the ways to do this. You can take 5h and bring it to this side. How do you do that? Through inverse operations. The opposite of minus 5h is plus 5h. So that eliminates it from this side, but whatever you do to one side, you always do to the other. So I'm also going to add 5h here. Now that's going to leave me with a really nice two-step equation, which you know how to do. 7 plus 8h equals negative 1. And how do you solve the rest of this? Just through some inverse operations. So minus 7, minus 7. Now that eliminates this here and leaves us with 8h equals negative 8. Now I'm going to divide by 8, which is 1 and eliminates it, and divide by 8. Negative 8 divided by positive 8 is negative 1, and that leaves us with h equals negative 1. Now, I'm going to be a little bit of an annoyance and get on you about checking your work for these problems in particular, because whatever you get here for your variable, you should be able to plug back in on both sides of the equation, and both sides should be equal to one another. So I should have 7 plus 3h equals negative 1 minus 5h. And if I plug in or substitute negative 1 into both of the h's, then both sides of this equation should be equal to one another. So I'm going to have 7 plus negative 3 equals negative 1 minus negative 5. 7 plus negative 3 is positive 4, and negative 1 minus a negative is really plus a positive, so that's also going to be 4. And now I've got both sides of the equation set equal to one another. I know that my original solution of h equals negative 1 is correct, and that's how it's done. Now just to recap real quick, you could have, for your first step, where it's bring all the variables to one side of the equation, you could have taken this 3h and subtracted it from both sides of the equation, and then solve your two-step equation just like that. It would look a little bit differently, but the ultimate answer, h equals negative 1, would be your result if you solve correctly. So you always have two options. It's your choice what you want to do. Just get in the habit of showing all your work, show the steps, and just be careful with your calculations. So let's look at another example. If you feel a little good about this, then you can pause the video and try. If not, you can just watch me solve. But here we go. I could take this 7b and move it over here because you want all the terms on one side of the equation so you can solve. Or you could take this b and move it over here. Personally, I'm going to b minus b, eliminate it from this side, and then do the same thing to move it here. And remember, what's always in front of a variable? 1. So 7b minus 1b is 6b minus 2 is 10. And now you're just solving inverse operations. This should be a breeze once you get to this part because we've been doing so many of these. So that eliminates here. And then my last step is to divide by 6 on both sides, leaving me with b equals 2. And remember, I'm going to double check just to make sure my work makes sense. So I'm going to substitute my answer, b equals 2, into the original. So b equals 2. Well, obviously this side, 2 plus 10, is going to be equal to 12. And then here I've got 7 times 2 is 14, and 14 minus 2 is 12. Both sides are equal, meaning my solution works, and that's all there is to this. Now, the other part of this comes when you're working with word problems, which I know is a weakness for many of you. So I'm going to do 2 word problem examples. I'll work through them both. Take your time with them. If you need to pause and rewind and just make sure you really understood what I did and what I said, please do that. So our first example, your science class is doing an experiment. You start with 2 plants. Now, I've got 2 different plants, so I'm going to organize this information. I've got plant A, and I've got plant B. Now, I'm jumping down to the question just to highlight something for you. It says predict how many days until the plants will be the same height. So the same height. Same is telling me, that I'm going to have these 2 things equal to one another at some point. Now, before I can do that, I need to figure out what their 2 equations are. What equation represents plant A in this example, and what represents plant B? So let's read the problem now to figure that out. It says you start with 2 plants. Plant A is 5 centimeters tall, and plant A, if I jump over to here, is fertilized and grows 2 centimeters per day. Well, that tells me its starting value, initial value, is 5, and plus it also grows 2 centimeters per day, and I'm going to use D for day. Now let's jump to plant B. It's 8 centimeters tall, so its initial value is 8, plus it grows 1.5 centimeters per day, so D for day. Now I've got an equation, and it's got a variable on one side and the other side, so I need to get all the terms on one side of the equation, and then I can just solve it easily. I'm going to move 1.5 D away from this side, and I'm going to put it over here. So that's going to leave me with 5 plus, and then 2 minus 1.5 is 1/2 D equals, and then there's 8 on this side of the equation, and the rest of this you should have no trouble with, considering how many we have been doing over the last couple days. So now I've got 1/2 D equals 3, and I'm going to divide both sides by 1/2, or 0.5, or 5/10, whatever you'd like to call it. So then I'm going to be left with D equals, and then 3 divided by 1/2 is 6. Now, just to be that annoying guy, I'm going to make you check. And remember, you can always just double check with a calculator very quickly. I'm just writing it out so everyone can see the checking and make sure that they understand what I'm doing. So I'm going to take D, which I got as 6, and I'm going to substitute it into the equation. Okay. And I'm going to solve real quick. So 6 times 2 is 12, and 12 plus 5 is 17. Now over here I've got 8 plus, and then 1.5 times 6. Well, I know 1.5 times 6 is 9, and then 9 plus 8 is also 17. So I've checked it out, it makes sense. But it's a word problem. Please go back and make sure you answer the question completely. Predict how many days until the plants will be the same height. Well, I got D equals 6. So that tells me in 6 days, both plants will be the same height. And that's it. That would be your final answer. But just make sure you actually answer the question, because sometimes you're solving and then you need to go back and answer something different. Make sure you've actually answered the correct question. So there's your first word problem. If you need to see that again, pause, rewind, and take your time through it. But I'm going to do one more word problem. And if you want to challenge yourself, pause the video and try it. If not, you can watch me work through it. And I'll have some summary questions for you to try on your own in the very last slide. So in this problem, we're comparing cell phone plans. One cell phone plan costs $29.94 per month plus 10 cents per text message. Another plan costs $32.99 per month plus 5 cents per text message. And we want to know, here's my key phrase, for what number of text messages will the monthly bill for both plans be the same? So the same tells me that they're going to be equal. So my first plan was $29.94 per month. So that's kind of like my initial value. That's my starting value. Every month I have to pay that. Plus, I'm also going to be paying 10 cents per, and I'm going to use M for text message. And that's going to be set equal to the other plan, which has a starting value of $32.99. You're paying that per month every time, no matter what. Plus, you're also setting 5 cents per message. So now I've got one equation for the first, one equation for the second plan. I set them equal to one another, and I notice, okay, I've got variables over here and variables over here. I need to bring them to the same side so that I can then solve much easier. I am going to take 5/100ths M, and I'm going to move it over here. And I'm doing that through subtraction. So I eliminated it here and brought it over here, leaving me with $29.94 plus 5/100ths, times M equals $32.99. And now to solve, just some basic math. Now over here I've got 5/10 M equals, and then a little bit of subtraction, 3 5/100ths, or 3.05. And I just want to pause real quick and make a quick note. Look how nice it looks that I have one equation left over down here. I started with this big thing, I showed my work, I rewrote. I did my next line, I showed my work, and then I rewrote the equation. It makes it much easier for you as you're going through this, and if you need to go back and check, and for me as well. So take your time, rewrite each line, make it nice and neat. If it's methodical and you can see what you've done one time, you can follow that same pattern, that same formula over and over again. So make it easier for yourself, especially when you're learning this stuff. So my last step is to divide both sides by 5/100ths, which leaves M over here, and I'm going to divide that. And if you did this on your calculator, hopefully you would find that you get M equals 61. And remember to check your work. So if I took 61 and plugged it in here, and plugged it in here, would they be equal? I'm going to leave that up to you to figure out, but the answer is yes, they would be equal. So go back and answer your question, for what number of text messages will the monthly plans be the same? You could word that however you want. I would say 61 messages or 61 texts would make the plans equal. And now we've answered the question. There we go. If you're not sure what I did or you need to see that one more time, there's not a problem with that. Go back, rewind, rewatch. If not, here are your two summary questions. So take a sec, pause the video, write them down in your notebook somewhere and give them a try. If you need to check your answers or have a question of how to do something, email me. I'll get right back to you. Other than that, I'll see you tomorrow in class, and do your best.